am going to show you how we're going to get started with our very first knitting project today. So this video is to accompany the pattern Cast Onto Cables, a Learn to Knit kit, which is going to be a sampler shawl. And I just wanted to go through the very basics of getting started. And this would be true for any knitting project that you're going to get started with. So the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to find the end of your ball of yarn. This is a cake of yarn. So this started off as a skein, which is a big loop, and it was wound into a cake like this. But any ball of yarn that you are ready to work with, you're going to have two ends. You're going to have the end that comes from the inside and the end that comes from the outside. And in this case, the two ends are tied together, which makes it easy to find both of them. In a lot of cases, you're going to have to dig around in the skein of yarn or in the ball of yarn to be able to find the end from the center. It is totally up to you which end you choose to pull from. If you pull from the middle, your ball of yarn will sit still as you pull the yarn out of it to do your work. But as you work farther, you're going to hollow out the center of your ball. The ball is going to collapse and it's going to be more likely to tangle on you. If you pull from the outside, your ball of yarn is going to wiggle around on you as you pull the yarn off of it, but your yarn is less likely to tangle up. So it's totally up to you which of those you prefer to do. In this case, I'm going to choose to pull from the center of the ball, and so I'm just going to take the tail that comes from the outside and tuck it in so that I'm not having that tail get tangled up as I'm working. Once we found the end of our ball of yarn, we are going to get the knitting needles. You want to choose the needle size recommended for your pattern or recommended for your yarn. Those should normally be the same thing. And so in this case, it is a worsted weight yarn. Worsted weight just means the thickness of the yarn. That's this sort of thickness. It's the most common thickness of yarn that's out there. It is also sometimes called a number 4 or a medium weight. And that yarn is normally going to recommend a US size 7 to 8 needles. And so these are US size 7 needles. And once you've got your needles and your yarn, the first step of any knitting project is going to be to tie a slip knot. So to tie a slip knot, you can choose to tie that any way that you like if you already know how you tie slip knots. This is generally the knot you use to tie balloons on little kids' wrists. But my favorite way to do it is to lay my yarn out like this, give it half a turn. So at this point, I think it looks like a fish. Here's the fish's head, and here's the tails coming out. And you are going to reach through the fish's head and grab one of the tails. You're going to leave the long ends of the tails on the outside, so you can put your hands on them if you want to, so that you remember not to let those come all the way through. And we're just going to take that strand that we grabbed, and we're just going to pull. You know that you've done it right if your loop changes size. So if you pull on the tails and the loop gets smaller, you know you tied your slip knot correctly. If you pull on the tails and nothing happens, you want to try it again. In a slip knot, if you do pull it all the way, it will just snap open like that. I'm going to do it one more time so that you can see. We give it half a turn, we reach through the fish's head, we grab one of the tails, we leave the long ends of the tails on the outside, and we just pull. As long as our slip knot changes sizes when we pull on the tails, we've done it the right way. You do want about a 6-inch tail hanging out on one end. If it is longer than that, that is totally fine and not at all a problem. If it's shorter than that, tie another slip knot. At the end of your project, you're going to be weaving in this tail. You don't need to weave in all 6 inches of it. You'll probably only be weaving in 2 or 3 inches. But if you make the tail only 2 or 3 inches long, it's really difficult to weave it in. So go ahead and leave it a long enough tail so that that's going to be comfortable to weave in. And then we are going to take this slip knot and we're going to put it on one of our needles. It doesn't matter which one, both needles are going to be exactly the same if you're using straight needles. Straight needles just means your needle has an end on it, so you've got a pointy end and a knobbly end. Circular needles are going to operate in the exact same way. The only part of the knitting needle that you use in any project is the pointy end. What happens at the other end doesn't matter. So circular needles will be connected by a string to each other, but the only thing that you're using is the pointy end, and the instructions are going to work exactly the same for both of them. So once we've put that slip knot on our needle, we are going to pull a tail. One tail will make the loop get smaller and one tail won't do anything. So if you start off and nothing happens when you pull on the tail, pull on the other tail instead. And you want to make this slip knot kind of touch your needle all the way around with a little tiny bit of give in there. You don't want to leave it super big and open, but you don't want to pull with every ounce of strength that you've got to make it super tight either. And that is how you get started with the very basics of your pattern. There will be another short video that will show you how to do a cast on for this project. I am showing you today how to do a very basic cast on. This is supposed to be to help with the Cables to Cast On Learn to Knit kit pattern, but we'll certainly show you how to begin casting on no matter what project you're doing. So I have already shown you how to select your yarn and your needles and how to tie a slip knot to get started. Now we're going to be beginning our cast on. The cast on style that I've chosen as the great cast on to begin if you're just learning how to knit is called the knitted cast on. The reason that I think this is great for beginners is because it's almost identical to the knit stitch. So once we've learned to cast on, we basically already know how to knit, which makes learning how to do the knit stitches a little bit easier when we get to that point. And it also means that you're more likely to remember how to do the cast on the next time you want to cast on a project. There are many, many other ways to cast on that can all be great. I just choose this for ease of learning. So we've got our slip knot on one of our needles. We want that to be kind of snug against our needles but not pulled super, super tight. We're going to put the needle with the loop on it in our left hand, and we're going to put the empty needle in our right hand. And the cast on is going to be 4 steps, and we are just going to do these 4 steps over and over and over again. So the first couple of times that you're trying to do them, if they don't go super smoothly, that's okay. We're going to be practicing many, many more times until they do feel super smoothly. So the 4 steps are, step number 1, we're going to take our right hand needle and we're going to put it through the loop on our left hand needle. We're going to go through the front loop, so there's a front loop, the front of the loop and the back of the loop. We're always going to be working through the front of the loop. We are going to be putting our right hand needle through the front of the loop from front to back so that that right hand needle pokes out underneath. Step 2, we're going to take our yarn. You want to make sure that that is the yarn that's connected to your ball of yarn rather than the short little tail. If you pick up the short little tail, you're going to run out of yarn pretty quickly, which is not what we want. So step 2, we're going to take the yarn. We're going to wrap it across that underneath needle. Just lay it straight across there. Step 3, we're going to take that new piece of yarn that we just wrapped across, and we're going to pull it from where it is now in the back. We're going to pull it right to the front, so that now we have a loop on each needle. And step 4, we're going to take that brand new loop that we just created on our right hand needle, and we're going to put it on our left needle and take that right hand needle out. So now we have 2 loops on our left needle, and our right hand needle is empty and doesn't have any loops on it. It will look like these 2 stitches are crossed over each other on your needle. It's supposed to. That's exactly what this is supposed to look like. You're doing it right. So let's go through those steps a few more times together. Step 1, we're going to take our empty right hand needle. We're going to insert it through the loop, the front of the loop, from front to back to make an X with our needle. Step 2, we're going to take our yarn and lay it across that underneath needle. Step 3, we're going to pull that loop from where it is right now in the back. We're going to pull it right through to the front. And step 4, we're going to take that brand new loop that we just created on our right hand needle, and we're going to put it over on the left needle. And you can tighten things up just a little bit if you want to. I do think it is easier to get started to have things a little on the loose side rather than a little on the tight side. So we are going to, step 1, needle goes in. Step 2, yarn goes around, and do always make sure this is the end of yarn connected to your ball. Step 3, this is the trickiest part for most people, so I'm actually going to pull things really loose so you can see this a little bit better. Here's the piece of yarn that we just laid across. We're going to take that piece of yarn that we just laid across and we're going to come under this strand. So almost like you're using chopsticks, you're going to take your right hand needle and pull it right underneath. And we've created a new loop on our right hand needle, and we're putting this across. You will notice that when I do this, I work very, very close to the tips of my needles. I mean, I'm way less than an inch away from the tips. I find that working that closely to the needle tips makes me have a little bit more control over what I'm doing. You'll also notice that I get my hands involved and put them on top of my stitches quite a bit. This is because I don't want loops to jump off my needles before I'm ready for them to. So when I'm transferring the brand new right hand stitch from my right needle to my left needle, I put my finger on top of these stitches that are already on my left needle because I don't want those stitches to jump off into the air. I want to take this right hand needle and put it over that way. And by having my finger on top, that means these 3 stitches that are already where I want them aren't going to go anywhere. And pull that tight. So this is called the knitted cast on, and the pattern is going to tell you to cast on 20 stitches. So you're going to do those exact same 4 steps over and over again until you have 20 loops on your needle. That very first stitch that we did, that very first loop we created, was actually created by a slip knot. It does still count as one of your 20. So we are going to cast on stitches until we have a total of 20 stitches, including that first one. And that is going to be your knitted cast on for this project. Now that we have completed the cast on, we have our 20 stitches on the needle. We are going to start on the first section of the sampler scarf, the cast on to cables pattern, and that is to create garter stitch. That is done by knitting every stitch of every row. So we're going to get started with the knit stitch. To do the knit stitch, you are going to do 4 steps very similar to when we cast on. The first 3 steps are actually going to be identical to the cast on. So step 1, we take our right hand needle and we put it through the loop on the left needle. Step 2, we take our yarn, again making sure it's the end that comes from our ball of yarn, that we're not using our tail. For at the beginning of this row, our tail will actually be at the other end, so it's not so likely to accidentally grab it, but at the beginning of the next row, it'll be important that we make sure that we're using the correct end of the yarn. So step 1, we put our right hand needle in. Step 2, we lay the yarn across that underneath needle. Step 3, we take that new strand of yarn that we just laid across and pull it through to the front. The only difference between casting on and the knit stitch happens right here. With the cast on, we take that new loop we just created on our right needle and we put it back on the left needle. For the knit stitch, we are going to keep that brand new stitch that we just created on our right hand needle. We're going to keep it on the right hand needle, so I actually choose to put my finger on top of it. That way it doesn't accidentally jump off when I don't want it to. And we're going to take the loop on our left hand needle and we're going to push that off into the air. And we're going to do those exact same 4 steps again. This time we've got a stitch on our right needle, but we don't do anything differently because of that. So step 1, we put our right hand needle in. Step 2, we lay the yarn across. Step 3, we pull that loop through to the front. And again, the loop we just created on our right hand needle stays there, so I put my fingers on top so they don't accidentally jump off. And the loop on our left needle does jump off into the air. That is how you do a knit stitch. And for creating garter stitch, where we just knit every stitch of every row, we are simply going to be knitting all the way across, doing those knit stitches on every loop of yarn all the way across. I will say that I have been knitting for about 20 years now, so if your knit stitches do not look as fast or as smooth as mine, that's okay. Give it 20 years. It does just take practice to get much more comfortable doing the knit stitches, and that's all right. The only way to get there is to practice more. We're going to knit all the way across, knitting each stitch one at a time, and so you're transferring one stitch at a time from the left hand needle onto the right hand needle. So every stitch we have one fewer on the left needle and one more on the right needle. When we get to the very last stitch on our needle, we're going to treat this very last stitch identical to every other stitch. So step 1, needle goes in, step 2, yarn goes across, step 3, we pull that loop through, and step 4, that last loop comes off the left needle. So we now have a totally empty left hand needle, and we have all of our stitches on the right needle. At the end of a row, especially at when you're first getting started knitting, I kind of like to pull and tug a little bit to make everything look neat and tidy at the bottom. I think this helps to be able to see that you've finished your first row and everything is looking how it's supposed to. One common issue that people have when they're getting started is what's called gauge or tension, and that means some of the stitches you're pulling a little bit tighter and some you're pulling a little bit looser, and that will make things look a little bit uneven on your needle, and that is okay. There's not a problem with that. As long as nothing is unraveling with your work, you're doing everything correctly. So that is completing your very first row of knitting, and to start your second row of knitting, you are simply going to switch hands. You're going to take the needle that has all the loops on it that was in your right hand, and you're going to put that into your left hand. You're going to pick up the needle, the empty needle that was in your left hand, and put it in your right hand. And now we are going to begin the exact same thing again. We are going to knit all the way across the stitches a second time. This time, because both tails are in the same place, you want to make sure that you are not using the tail, the short end of yarn, and that you're using the end connected to your ball. And we are going to start the exact same thing. We're going to take that right hand needle and poke it through the stitch from front to back. Step 2, lay the yarn across. Step 3, pull that loop through. Step 4, push it off. And we are just going to knit to the end of this row as well. And this pattern tells us how many rows to do of our knitting, and that's how many rows that you're going to do. You're going to, every time you get to the end of a needle, you have completed one row of knitting. The cast on does not count as a row. So you are going to cast on your stitches, and then the pattern tells you to work your 34 rows of knitting. You are going to do 34 rows after the cast on. And there are a lot of ways to keep track of how many rows that you've done. One way is to make tally marks on the piece of paper if you're a paper copy pattern kind of a person. There are a lot of apps that you can get for your phone or tablet that will keep track as well. Or you can use row counters, little devices that slide onto your needles themselves that you can turn to keep track of what number row that you're on. And that is how we are going to work the garter stitch pattern. We have already gone over how to do our cast on for this project. We've learned to do our knit stitch and knit every stitch of every row, which produces the garter stitch fabric. And right now I'm going to show you how to do the purl stitch. And that is what is going to create the fabric that you see right here. Now, a question that I get asked a lot is, how does a knit stitch look different from a purl stitch? And that is a complicated question to answer because the answer is a knit stitch looks identical to a purl stitch from the back, and a purl stitch looks identical to a knit stitch from the back. They are mirror images of each other, and so if you point to one stitch and say, was this stitch knit or purled? I have no idea. What I can tell you is when I look at this fabric, I know that one whole row was knit and then one whole row was purled. Just like if I look at just this fabric, I know that every stitch was knit. So I'm going to show you how to do the purl stitch now, and then you'll know how to create fabric that looks like this as well. When you do create this kind of fabric that you knit an entire row and then purl an entire row, this fabric is going to curl on the edges and on the ends. So if you do an entire scarf done with this kind of stitch, your scarf is going to curl up into a tiny tube. You're not doing anything wrong. That's what that fabric is supposed to do, but it's not what most people want their scarves to look like. So that's why in this scarf pattern, we're only doing it for a fairly small amount of time, and it is less likely to curl. You'll also notice in this particular pattern, you have a little bit of a different looking fabric on the edge. Generally, if you are doing this stockinette stitch fabric on something like a scarf, you're going to do the edge in some kind of a stitch combination that doesn't curl. So on this pattern, the pattern itself is going to tell you to knit the first and the last 4 stitches of every row, even on the rows where you're purling the rest of the time. And that creates this edge that makes it less likely to roll. If you do the entire scarf this way, it will still roll up. Those 4 stitches will lay flat and your whole scarf will still curl up into a tube. But it's going to, for a small piece, it's going to keep things a little bit straighter. So, as a quick review of the knit stitch, we are going to, as the pattern is going to be telling you, you'll be looking at the pattern as well, following along if that's the way that you're going with this. To review the knit stitch, we put our needle in, we wrap our yarn around, we pull that loop through, and we push the loop off into the air. So the pattern is telling us to knit 4 stitches. We are going to knit 4 stitches. And then the pattern is going to tell us to purl to the last 4 stitches. One big trick that needs to happen, the difference when you're getting ready to do a purl stitch, your yarn needs to be in front of your needles. When you're doing a knit stitch, the yarn is in the back. So we've just finished knitting. We need to bring the yarn to the front of our work so that that yarn is in the front to be able to do our purl stitch. And the exact same 4 steps are going to happen for purling that they did for knitting. But the big important part is we have our yarn beginning in the front before we start any of these steps. So step 1, we put our needle in from back to front so that that right hand needle pokes out towards us. Step 2, we're going to bring the yarn up and over that front needle. Step 3, we're going to take that loop that we just laid across and pull it back through the loop on our left needle. And then step 4, that loop on our left needle is going to jump off into the air. We'll do that again. Again, 4 steps to purl, just like the 4 steps to knitting. The only real difference is you're putting your needle in a slightly different way. So step 1, our right hand needle goes in from back to front so that needle pokes out towards us. Step 2, we take our yarn and go up and over. Step 3, we pull that new strand of yarn that we just laid across underneath. And the last step, this loop jumps off into the air. And that is how we do a purl stitch. And so we are going to purl. The pattern tells us how many stitches to purl, or in this case, the pattern tells us to purl until we have 4 stitches remaining at the end. So we're going to purl until we get fairly close over there, and then we're going to stop and count. We have 4 stitches left, 1, 2, 3, 4, and now the pattern is going to tell us to knit those last 4. And again, the biggest trick when it's switching between knits and purls is to take your yarn for purling, the yarn is in the front. We're getting ready to knit. We're going to take our yarn between the 2 needle tips to the back. And we're going to knit those last 4 stitches, just like knitting that we've done before. Knit those last 4 stitches. And this pattern, so the first pattern that we did, the very first step, we did the exact same thing every row. We knit every stitch of every row for the whole project, or for that whole section. This section is made up of 2 different rows. The row that we just completed was our purl row, and if you look at the fabric here, it looks kind of bumpy. It looks like an inside-out sweater, is kind of what I tell people. When we're looking at that fabric, that means we've just completed or are getting ready to start a purl row. So this is the purl side. Most of the time that's referred to as the wrong side, and in patterns the abbreviation WS for wrong side will be used sometimes. So if it's saying row 1 and in parentheses WS, that means wrong side, and that's the side they're talking about. When we finish that row and flip around to this row, now we are looking at the right side of the fabric. Again, I think it looks like a right side out sweater, like a sweater that you would go buy at the store. And to me, I see the letter V. I see a lot of little letter V's all stacked up on top of each other. This is the knit side of the fabric, the right side, and in patterns, the abbreviation RS for right side will be used. I do think most of us know how to spell wrong side, but when you're in the middle of keeping track of a bunch of other things, it can be confusing because the word wrong sounds like it starts with an R. So when you see RS, remember that is right side, WS is wrong side. It's not telling you to do anything, it's just telling you which way should you be looking at your fabric. And that is how we do the knit stitch at the bottom. knit every stitch of every row, and then switch between knits and purls for this stockinette stitch fabric. I am going to be showing you how to work a basic basket weave pattern today. So you can see here I already have the basics started of a basket weave. A basket weave kind of appears as if you've woven strips of fabric over and under each other by creating these sections of stockinette stitch, which is knit one row, purl one row, looking at the right side, and reverse stockinette stitch, which is knit one row, purl one row, looking at the wrong side. So stockinette stitch looks one way, this sort of V-shaped smooth way from one direction, and looks the other way, this bumpy, like inside out sweater looking way from the other direction. So you can see if I look at this square that looks bumpy on this side, and I turn it to the other side, it looks exactly the same as the square next to it on the other side. So that's what's creating the basket weave look, is you're doing knit one row on the first section, purl one row on the second section. And every fourth row, you are sort of changing directions for which way you go. I think as I keep going with this, it's going to make a little bit more sense exactly what I'm talking about. So to do the very basics of the basket weave, and the pattern, the Learn to Knit Kit Cast Onto Cables pattern, is going to give you the exact instructions. But the basic idea of the basket weave is you are going to knit 4 stitches and then you're going to purl 4 stitches. So I'm going to show you how to switch between knits and purls as the very first thing. So to do the knit stitch, we put the needle in from front to back. We pick up our yarn in the back of our work. We pull that loop through to the front and we push the stitch off the edge into the air. So that's just your basic knit stitch. We're going to do 4 of those in a row. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we are switching from 4 knit stitches. Now the pattern is telling us to do 4 purl stitches. And so we are going to, before we put our needle into our fabric, we are going to take the yarn from where it is now at the back, and we are going to bring it to the front of our work. And we're going to do our 4 purl stitches, just like a normal purl. So we put our needle in from back to front, so that needle pokes out towards us. We go up and over our needle. We pull the yarn through to the back, and we push that loop off the edge into the air. A totally normal purl stitch. And we are going to do 4 purl stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 purl stitches. So we've got 4 knit stitches and 4 purl stitches there. Now, one of the parts about the basket weave that does make it a little bit more involved than just knit an entire row or purl an entire row is that you want to make sure that you are switching between knits and purls in the correct place. It doesn't seem like it's a difficult thing to count to 4, but when you're keeping track of all of the other things and just learning how to do a knit stitch and a purl stitch, it can actually be pretty tricky. So not only is it useful to count to 4 as you're working, but to also look at your fabric to see that you're making that switch between knits and purls in the right spot. So if you look here, you can see this section of fabric looks like those letter V's all stacked up. These indicate that you should be knitting those stitches now to keep creating that letter V looking pretty right side stockinette stitch fabric. And so since I put my 4 knit stitches on top of that fabric, I know those were in the right spot. When I did my 4 purl stitches, those are on top of these 4 bumpy stitches of fabric. That's the purl side of our stockinette stitch, and so we know we put those 4 purl stitches in the right spot. And now our pattern is telling us to do 4 more knit stitches. Again, my yarn was in the front because I was purling. I'm going to take that yarn to the back between my 2 needles. I'm ready to do 4 knit stitches because that's what my pattern says, but I'm also ready to do 4 knit stitches because that's what my knitting says. I see 4 stitches here that all look like that letter V right up against my needle, and that means when we're creating the stockinette stitch, we want to do knit stitches on top of those. So 4 knit stitches is what my pattern says and what my knitting says. Now I'm ready to switch to 4 purl stitches, and again my pattern says 4 purls and my fabric says 4 purls because I have 4 of those little bumps, 4 of the reverse stockinette stitch, the wrong side stockinette stitch. And then the last step of the pattern for this row is going to be to knit 4 stitches. So that's the basic of basket weave. You are just alternating knit 4, purl 4 every row for basket weave. You'll find when you're looking at the pattern, you're going to do that for 4 rows in a row. You're going to be stacking knit stitches, the V's on top of V's, and purl stitches, the bumps on top of bumps. After you've done those 4 rows, you're actually going to do one row where you switch. You can see right here, this was a switching row where suddenly you go from the square that is the V-shaped, that right side stockinette stitch, to the 4 stitches being reverse stockinette stitch, the purl side of stockinette stitch. And that's what creates the fabric, the pattern that we're going for. So we have just finished the 4 rows where you're putting knit stitches on top of the V's and purl stitches on top of the bumps. We've just finished row 4 in our pattern. And our pattern is now going to tell us to swap which one we're doing. So the first 4 rows, if we see these bumps on our needle, we would be purling. This is the switching row where we create that swap row with our fabric. And so we are going to follow the pattern. The pattern is telling us to begin by knitting 4 stitches. When I look at my fabric, I'm going to think that doesn't make sense. Those are purl stitches. But for this row, the pattern tells us to knit 4. Our fabric has bumps like we should purl 4, but we know that this is that row where we switch. Which square is stockinette stitch and which square is reverse stockinette stitch. So we are going to knit 4 stitches like the pattern tells us and ignore the fact that those 4 stitches look like they should be purled according to our fabric. And then we're going to have that same thing all the way across. The pattern is going to tell us to purl 4, even though looking at our fabric, this looks like we should be knitting those 4 because it's those V's. And this is because we're doing the row where we swap which square is which, and that creates our fabric. And so again, I'm going to follow the pattern all the way across. And I know that I've gotten to the end of the 4 stitches because my fabric switches from the purl bump side to the knit V side. So I was knitting, my yarn was in the back, I bring my yarn to the front, and now I'm purling. And I purl those 4, and I bring my yarn to the back, and I knit the last 4. So that was my switching row, where I switched that was the row where you changed from this section to the next section. And for the next rows of knitting, we're going to go back to where if we see the bumps on our needles, we are going to purl, and if we see the V's on our needle, we are going to knit. And that's going to create the next square of fabric. And you are going to follow the pattern and do it for as many times as the pattern is telling you to, and we're going to be creating a square for our sampler scarf. So we're going to have five rows of these squares. So here's 1 row of squares, 2 rows of squares, 3 rows of squares, 4 rows of squares, and I've just started my 5th row of squares. So it's going to create this is going to be a square of 5 squares tall by 5 squares wide. And that's going to be our basket weave section of our sampler scarf. We are now going to go over how to work the moss stitch in knitting. And this is a combination of changing between the knit stitch and the purl stitch every single stitch. So if you're doing the Cast Onto Cables Learn to Knit kit in order, you have just completed the basket weave section, and this has allowed you to practice switching between knit stitches and purl stitches, but you're doing several of each before you make that changeover, and that creates this fabric here. The moss stitch, sometimes called the seed stitch, you are knitting just 1 stitch and then purling just 1 stitch. So you're switching between knits and purls every single stitch. But the basic principle is exactly the same as the basket weave. You're just doing it a little bit more often. And the biggest trick with the moss stitch is being able to tell which row you are getting ready to start. Because if you get off by even one stitch on this pattern, it's not going to show up the way that you want it to and give you these little, the little kind of textured bumps that you see here. So this is one that's very important to look at your fabric and not just at your pattern. So for this particular row, I am getting ready to begin a row 2, which will begin with a purl 1. And so it will be purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1 all the way across. And I know from looking at my pattern that that's the row that I'm on, but I also know from looking at my fabric. So generally when you're looking at your needles, as you're about to put your needle in, so you have the needle with all the loops on it in your left hand and you have your empty needle in your right hand, you are going to look at the stitch right here, and if it looks like that letter V, so you don't see a bump right up against your needle, but you see that letter V look, that means that you have completed a purl stitch on the previous row. Now for stockinette stitch, when you're knitting a whole row and purling a whole row, that means that when you see that letter V look up against your needle, you are ready to do a knit stitch now. But the moss stitch is going to be exactly the opposite of that. So exactly the opposite of normal. When you see that V, it means you purled the previous row. You want to purl again. So in my head, when I'm looking at my fabric, if I see V, I know I want to purl it now. So I'm going to begin with a purl 1. So I do a purl stitch just like normal. And then again, just like every time you're switching between knits and purls in the same row, you're going to take your yarn in the front for purling. You're going to move it between your 2 needles to the back for knitting. I just did a purl 1, so my pattern tells me that it's time to do a knit 1, and my fabric tells me that it's time to do a knit 1. I see that bump. When you're doing the moss stitch, that bump means to knit. So I do a totally standard knit stitch, and then again I bring my yarn from where it is in the back for knitting to the front for purling. And I'm just going to keep repeating those 2 stitches. Purl when it looks like a V, knit when it looks like that bump right up against my needles. And you're just switching back and forth between each one, changing where your yarn is between each stitch. So it's in the back for knitting, you bring it to the front, you do your purl stitch, it's in the front for purling, you put it in the back. The moss stitch does take a little bit longer than some of the other stitches because you have to move your yarn in between your needles every single stitch. But I really love the way that it looks, and so to me that's worth doing. I hope you enjoy practicing switching between those knits and purls just a little bit more often. We are going to go over the very basics of increasing and decreasing right now. So increasing just means you are adding a stitch or multiple stitches to the total number of loops on your needle, and decreases means that you are taking some of those stitches away. Now this comes up in our Learn to Knit kit for the first time in this slip stitch whiskers block. I have a different video that actually shows you how to create the look of this pattern, but what we do at the very beginning before we start working on the textured fabric here is we need to create a brand new stitch. The reason for this has to do with the stitch count. You need a different number of stitches to keep everything centered here than you have in the rest of the pattern, as well as the fact that this particular stitch actually pulls your fabric in just a little bit as you're slipping stitches across. And so adding an extra stitch so that you have 21 stitches is actually going to make this particular section be the same width as all of the other ones instead of pulling in and being a little bit narrower. But the practicalities of creating a new stitch are going to be the same no matter what reason you are doing it for. So this pattern is having you do an increase called a make 1. That's abbreviated M1 for make 1. And this does not mean create a new loop any way you want to. It's a very specific way that it wants you to create a new loop. And that is by pulling up a strand of yarn that's between the loops on your 2 needles. So you're going to have a loop on your right hand needle, a loop on your left hand needle, and you're going to have the fabric that's in between your needles. We are going to grab that strand of fabric that's in between, and you are going to be putting it on your left needle. And you do want to do it this way, where the right hand side of that loop is behind and the left hand side of that loop is in front. So let me do that one more time so you can see how we accomplish that. We put our right hand needle in like this to pull that loop up, and then we stick it over that left hand needle so that that right loop is behind and that left loop is in front. And now we are going to knit into that stitch exactly as if it was a normal stitch. So we've just pulled a loop up. When we go to put our needle in, it feels a little bit awkward because that stitch is twisted. It's supposed to be that way. You're doing it right. If it didn't feel twisted that way, it would create a little gap, a little hole in your project. So we put our needle in exactly as if we were doing a normal knit stitch. We wrap the yarn around just as if we were doing a normal knit stitch. We pull it all the way through just like normal, and we push that loop off just like a completely normal knit stitch. This is a make one. This has created a brand new loop out of nothing. And then we continue on with our pattern. So the pattern for this piece told us to knit 10 stitches. So we knit 10 stitches exactly like normal. Then we did our make one stitch. And then the pattern tells us to knit the last 10 stitches. And so you are going to knit the last 10 stitches exactly as every other stitch that you have knit. And that increases so that you will have 21 stitches on your needle. Because we added an extra stitch for this block, we will need to take away that extra stitch at the end of this block so that our scarf isn't wider the whole way through. And when you get to the end of the instructions for this block, it is going to tell you to work a decrease of a knit 2 together. And that decrease is exactly what you would expect it to. You are going to take the 2 loops closest to the tip of your needle. You're going to kind of push them next to each other, and you are going to treat these 2 loops as if they were just one. And you are going to knit those 2 loops together. So we put our needle through both of them as if they were just one stitch. We wrap our yarn around, we pull our yarn through, and we push those both off the edge into the air. You will do that at the very end of that slip stitch whiskers block that you've worked, and that will take away the extra stitch that you added at the beginning. And you'll do that where the pattern is telling you to. We are going to be working today on the slip stitch texture pattern in the Cast Onto Cables Learn to Knit kit pattern, and I will link to that where you can get the pattern in the comment section here if you want to follow along. So we are going to be showing how to make these. I think they kind of look like whiskers, the textured pattern that you see on here. And you create this pattern by doing 2 things. The first one is you need to create these long strands across the front, the right side of your work. And you do that by slipping stitches with your working yarn held in front. Once you've created those long strands, the 3 strands across the front of your work, then you're going to be on the last row above those 3 sections. You're going to be catching those long strands, and that's what creates the actual look here that we're working on. So to create the long sections, you are going to follow along with what the pattern is telling you to do. In this case, you are going to knit 3 stitches for the edging. That's the garter stitch edge. That creates the edge, the non-roll edge on the side of the piece. And you are going to, now the pattern is going to tell you to slip 5 stitches with yarn in front, abbreviated WYIF, with yarn in front. So for the knit stitch, our yarn is in the back. We are going to bring our yarn to the front of our work, almost as if we were purling, and we are just going to slip the next 5 stitches. So you're going to take your needle, you're going to insert it through the next loop as if you were doing a purl stitch, and you're just going to slip that stitch across. You're not actually going to purl it. Anytime a pattern tells you to slip a stitch, it always wants you to slip the stitch as if to purl, unless the pattern specifically says slip knitwise. So we have slipped 5 stitches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, with the yarn in the front. Now you are going to return the yarn to the back of our work, and the pattern is now going to have us catch these 3 long strands that we've made in the previous 3 rows in the exact same way that we're creating long strands on this side this time. So again, following the pattern, when you're catching these 3 stitches, these are created across 5 stitches, and when we're going to catch them, we're going to catch them right in the middle. So we're going to be working with that 3rd stitch. So the pattern is telling us to knit 2 stitches exactly like normal. We're going to go ahead and knit those 2 stitches exactly like normal. And then the pattern tells us to knit 1 under wraps. So we're going to take our needle and we're going to go underneath all 3 of those long strands. We're just going to put our needle underneath all 3 of those long strands. We're not going through the fabric, we're just going under those 3 strands that stick out on top of the fabric. And then we're going to knit 1 stitch exactly like normal. Put our yarn in, put our needle in, wrap our yarn around, pull it through. We are then, instead of just coming under the 1 stitch like we normally do, we're going to pull it under all 3 of those wrap stitches as well. And now we're going to push that stitch off just like a normal knit stitch. And now the pattern is telling us to knit 2 more stitches. We're going to knit those completely normally. So we have caught those 3 strands under there, and that creates the overall look that we're going for. And the pattern is going to be telling you how to create this layout of those textured slip stitches. So that is how you do this stitch pattern. Now I'm showing you how to do a very basic lace pattern. Now lace in knitting just is holes on purpose. These holes are often positioned in a pattern that makes a pretty design or a consistent design, and so you can see the holes all line up in the same way for this one. But those holes are created by doing yarn overs, which just means putting your yarn over your needle. Now that yarn over creates the visible hole, but it also adds a stitch. So if you had 20 stitches to start with and you do one yarn over, you will have 21 stitches on your needle. And so when we're doing a lace piece, every time we do a yarn over, we have to do a decrease as well, so that we don't end up with 100 stitches on our needle instead of the 20 that we're supposed to have. So every time you're doing lace, the pattern is always going to have you do 1 decrease for every yarn over that you're doing in the pattern. So again, following along with your pattern, we are going to do knit 2 stitches exactly like every other 2 normal stitches. You're going to have this on most edges. You're going to do something a little bit different than you do in the rest of it, and that just creates a non-rolling edge, a 2-stitch garter stitch edging that's going to make things not roll and look a little bit more consistent. And I am showing you how to do row 3 of this pattern, and that tells you to begin with a knit 2 together. And so you've got 2 stitches right next to each other. A knit 2 together is just you are going to insert your needle into both of those stitches just like it's a normal stitch. Wrap your yarn around just like a normal knit stitch. Pull that strand through under both of those loops, treating them as if they were just 1 stitch, and then slide them both off the edge into there. The pattern now tells us to do a yarn over, and a yarn over, we are simply going to wrap the yarn around our right hand needle, not having inserted that needle into anything. So that is what creates your hole. And the pattern tells you now to repeat that across. So we knit 2 stitches together, and we yarn over. Knit 2 stitches together, and we yarn over. We're going to do that all the way to the end of our row. One thing that's important to keep in mind when you are working with a pattern that has you doing repeats is that you are going to repeat what is inside the parentheses or the brackets or the little star. You're not going to repeat every single thing in the entire row. So at the beginning of this row, we did a knit 2 stitches, and that created our edging. We are not going to repeat that knit 2 stitches all the way across. We are simply repeating the knit 2 together yarn over all the way to the end. Another thing that is very important to remember is you want to make sure that you complete the entire repeat on the very last one. So the pattern is going to tell you to repeat that until you're 2 stitches from the end. And what you are repeating is a knit 2 together and then a yarn over. So I'm doing my last knit 2 together What is very easy to happen here is you see 2 stitches. The pattern says repeat until 2 stitches from the end, and then you're going to knit those last 2 stitches. What you want to make especially sure is that you do not forget the very last yarn over, because what you were repeating was a knit 2 together and then a yarn over. So you need to make sure you get that very last step in there. So we repeated the entire thing to 2 stitches from the end. We did not forget that last yarn over, and we are going to knit those last 2 stitches. Now row 1, the pattern is going to be to do a yarn over and then a knit 2 together, and so you are going to complete row 1 after you have finished a knit 2 together, because that was the last part of the repeat. So you do want to make sure that you're understanding exactly what you're repeating and what should be the last stitch that you do. And as in most lace pieces, there is what's called a rest row every other row. So the majority of lace patterns, you are going to be doing your yarn overs and your corresponding decreases on the right side only, the pretty side of your work, and on the wrong side, you're either going to be knitting the entire row all the way across or purling the entire row all the way across. It's unusual to have a lace pattern where you do yarn overs on both rows. So this gives you a rest row, a row where you don't have to think too hard about counting and paying all that much attention to the exact pattern that you're following. So this pattern is having us knit all the way across. And do notice when you've got this yarn over on your needle, it looks a little bit different than a standard stitch. We are going to knit into it exactly as if it were a standard stitch. So we're just going to insert our needle, wrap our yarn around, and push that off the edge into the air. We are only dealing with the stitches that are around our needle at the top. So the fact that we have done some yarn overs and some knit 2 togethers in the previous row is not going to change how we knit this rest row. So we just knit all the way across and continue on in our lace pattern. And that's how you work a very basic lace. This video is to show you how to do a knitting technique called embossing and how to work from a chart while you do it. This technique combines reverse stockinette stitch, which creates this bumpy texture, with right side stockinette stitch, which creates the smooth V-shaped sections. And alternating between those allows you to put different shapes into your knitting. It creates a subtle difference in the way your piece looks, and in this case we're creating a diamond with that. So to do this technique, you're often going to work with a pattern that contains a chart, simply because it's the most straightforward way to know that you are on the right track as you're working along on your project. So when you are reading from a chart, you are going to look at the row of the chart that you are getting ready to knit, and each square of the chart, each box of the chart, is going to tell you what to do for that particular stitch. So this piece, the instructions are going to tell you that you are always going to knit the first 3 and the last 3 stitches of every row, and that those stitches are not charted. So those 3 stitches we knit, those are not going to be on the chart. The chart for the row that we are getting ready to do has 2 empty boxes, and empty boxes from the key on the chart are telling you that you are going to knit those stitches when you're looking at the right side. So we have 2 empty boxes. We are going to do 2 knit stitches. The next box of our chart is going to have a letter P in it, which stands for purl. Now, depending on the pattern that you're reading, the symbols that mean different things may be different. Sometimes it will be a dot instead of a letter P, or there are a bunch of other symbols that can be used to mean different stitches. But when you look at the key for the chart that you're working from, the letter P means purl. So as always, when we're switching from knits to purls, we bring our yarn from the back, from where it is for knitting, to the front. And another thing to note is when you are looking at the image that appears on the chart, you will see a diamond. Those letter P's stack up to create a diamond shape on the chart pattern. And when you look at the exact row that you were doing, you're going to see that there's a letter P sitting on top of what was an empty box on the previous row. That means when I look at my piece here, I see that the last stitch in the last row that I did was knitted, and the chart is telling me that I should put a purl stitch on top of a knit stitch. And that's exactly what my work is telling me as well. So I know that I am on the right track. And you are going to do the number of purl stitches, as there are boxes that tell you to do purl stitches across. And notice on the line of the pattern, from the chart that you're working from, the last P for purl sits on top of an empty box from the row below, which means the last purl stitch that we do should sit on top of a knit stitch from the previous row. And it does. So again, we know we're on the right track. And the last two boxes on this particular row are empty, which again means you want to do a knit stitch. And it is always a good sign when your pattern ends and your project ends at the same point. It means you've counted correctly all the way across. And remember, the chart instructions tell you that we are knitting the first and last 3 stitches across. That is how we work the right side row of this embossing pattern. The wrong side rows are not charted, and the reason for that is because when you're working stockinette and reverse stockinette stitches, the symbols would mean different things for different rows. So an empty box on the right side means knit. An empty box on the wrong side means purl, because combining knit in one row and purl in the other row is what creates stockinette stitch. A lot of people find that set of instructions confusing, and so in my chart, I simply tell you for wrong side rows, knit the first and last 3 stitches, and work in pattern for the rest of the stitches. This also gives you a chance to practice reading your knitting. So what that means to work in pattern is, again, we are always going to knit the first and last 3 stitches. 1, 2, 3. And then work in pattern means you are going to purl the stitches that look like bumps, and you are going to knit the stitches that look like V's. And so for this pattern, we knit the first 2, or we purl the first 2 stitches because they look like bumps. Remember to put your yarn to the back for knitting. And we are going to knit all the way across until we switch back to the purl bumps again. And if you're not sure exactly how many that should be, if you remember on the previous row, we knit the last 2 stitches to create the stockinette stitch, and on this row, we purl those same 2 stitches. So the number of stitches that you knit on the right side row, you're going to be purling those exact same stitches on the wrong side row. And that is how you work the embossing technique from a chart. I am going to be showing you today how to do a cable turn. That is what it's called on the one row in a cable pattern where you're actually crossing the stitches over each other to create the look of the cable. The vast majority of cable knitting, you're actually just doing knits and purls to kind of do the setup for the background that creates the cable look. It is only, in this particular pattern, it is only once every 6th row that you're actually doing something that's specific for cabling. And so the 6th row, the cable turn row, you are going to follow the directions written in the pattern, and that is going to tell you to knit the first 3 stitches. These are forming the non-rolling garter stitch edge that you have on your pattern. Then you're going to knit the next 3 stitches. These are the stockinette stitch background. Purl the next 2 stitches, and again you bring your yarn between the needles when you're switching from a knit stitch to a purl stitch. Purl the next 2 stitches. That creates the reverse stockinette stitch visual division that you get before the cable. And now we're actually ready to do the cable turn. And in this pattern and most patterns, the cable turn is abbreviated with the with the abbreviation C6F. That means your cable is worked over 6 stitches, so the 6 stitches of the cable. So 6, and then C stands for cable, and then F stands for front. And that is telling us that when we are putting our stitches, when we are holding our stitches to either side of the work, we're going to be holding them to the front for this cable. The other option is B for back. So a cable 6 to the front, how we do that is we are going to slide half of the total number of stitches. So half of 6 is 3. We're going to slide 3 stitches onto a cable needle. I really like totally straight cable needles. They look exactly like double points, and in some cases are double points. So you slide half of the total number of stitches onto a cable needle, and because this is a front twisting cable, we are going to hold those stitches to the front. If it was a back twisting cable, we would put the stitches to the back of our work. Then we are going to knit the other half of the cable stitches. So I'm going to knit the next 3 stitches completely as normal. So this first stitch that we do, there is a gap where those 3 stitches are on the needle, and we are not going to leave extra space with, we're not going to leave extra space, kind of a long strand of yarn hanging out there. We're just going to knit the next stitch exactly like it was a normal stitch. So we're going to knit the other half of the cable stitches. So we put 3 on the cable needle, and then we knit 3, and now we're going to take those 3 stitches and we're going to slide them back on to this needle. Slip them right back on there, and you're finished with the cable needle for now, so you can set that aside until it's time to do the next cable row. We are going to knit those last 3 stitches. So you're knitting 6 stitches for the cable, you're just knitting them out of order. You're knitting the last 3 stitches first, and then you're knitting the first 3 stitches, and that twists the fabric across itself, and that's what creates the look of that cable. And then we just finish that pattern row as it is written, where we're purling 2 and then knitting to the end of the row. And that is how you do a cable turn row. Again, with cables, the vast majority of the knitting when you're working cables is actually just going to be knit stitches and purl stitches. It's only once every 6th row for this particular pattern that we're actually going to be doing that cable twist. When you finished the cable twist row, it looks a little sort of smooshed up on your needle, but the next few rows that we do past that are going to make that open up, and you're really going to see the cables show up. So that is how you work a cable twist. Once you have completed the entire scarf, the last step of this project is going to be to bind off all of your stitches. To do that, the pattern is going to tell you that you are going to knit 2 stitches exactly like normal. So needle in just like normal, yarn around, pull it through, the left one jumps off. Needle in, yarn around, pull it through, left one jumps off. Once you have knit 2 stitches exactly like normal, you are going to take the first stitch that you knit, the one farther away from your needle tip on your right hand needle, and you're going to pull that up and over the one in front of it and off the edge into the air, so that you have one remaining stitch on that right hand needle. You are now going to knit 1 more stitch exactly as usual, so that you have 2 stitches left on your right hand needle. You are going to pick the farther away one up and over and off the edge into the air. Knit 1 additional stitch so that you have 2 stitches on your right hand needle. Pick 1 up and over the edge. Some people prefer to do this using their other needle, so you can actually use your other needle tip to grab that stitch and pull it up and over. For me personally, I find that a little bit more awkward, and I prefer to use my finger to pick it up and over. But when a pattern is telling you to bind off, sometimes this will be abbreviated BO for bind off or CO for cast off. They both mean exactly the same thing, and this is what the pattern wants you to do. You are just going to keep doing those steps until you've taken every single loop off of your needles. Although there are many different ways to cast on, to put loops onto your needles, there are far fewer ways to bind off. This is by far the most common, to the point where it is not really going to have a specific name. This is just what is referred to when they're talking about binding off. This is the method that patterns are going to want you to use. There are a couple of decorative bind-offs that a pattern in the future may have you do, but they will be very clear on how exactly they want you to do that. So anytime a pattern is just telling you to bind off, they mean for you to be doing it this way. And the very last stitch on your needle, you are going to knit, and you can set that needle aside. And you're going to do the exact same thing. Take the farther away one up and over the one in front of it. Once you've completed the entire bind off, this is what it's going to look like. It's totally finished off. There's no loose loops. You have one loop at the very, very end. My recommendation is pull your needle to make that loop larger, and then cut your yarn, leaving at least a 6-inch tail. If you're using 100% wool yarn, you can break it if you don't happen to have a pair of scissors handy. And then you are going to take the end of the yarn that you cut or broke, and you're going to poke it through that loop. It doesn't matter if you go from back to front or front to back, as long as you take that tail and put it through the loop. And then you are simply going to pull on that tail. And that completely fastens this off. And you are now totally done with your first scarf. There's going to be another video about how to block it. I would recommend blocking before you weave the ends in. And so stay tuned to see how to do that part as well. But congratulations on finishing the knitting on your first scarf. Today I'm going to be showing you how to block our finished Learn to Knit Kit Cast Onto Cables project, the very first project that you may well have done. Blocking is important for a couple of different reasons. Blocking can help even out some stitch idiosyncrasies. So if you have some stitches, especially in something like a stockinette stitch, where you will naturally have some stitches that are a little bit tighter, some that are a little bit looser. When you're looking at a large section of stockinette stitch, you're often going to see some idiosyncrasies in there. It doesn't mean that you did your stitches wrong. That's something that blocking is going to even tighten the loose stitches out and make things lay a little bit nicer. Something else that blocking is going to do is to make lace lay flatter and spread out and really show the lace off. So the lace sections that you've done, the holes themselves can look a little bit small and kind of smushed together. Blocking is really going to help open those up so that you really see the lace a lot more. And the same thing for the cable. The cable section that you've worked, the edges around the cable are kind of going to have a tendency to want to pull in a little bit. Blocking is going to make those lay flat. So blocking helps open up lace, helps stitch patterns show up a little bit nicer, and just generally makes things look a little bit better. And it is not a complicated thing to do at all. I have a bucket of warm water, just the temperature that it comes out of your sink in your kitchen is the right temperature. You are going to take your piece and totally submerge it in that warm water. You don't need to agitate it tons, but make sure it's completely underneath the water surface. And we're just going to let it sit for a minute or two. Make sure that the fibers get all the way saturated. Once it's sat and is fully soaked all the way through, and if you forget it and leave it for an hour or two, that doesn't hurt it at all, you are just going to pick your piece up and wring out as much of the water as you can. Now your piece is not incredibly fragile at this point. You don't have to worry with this level of scrunching that you're going to felt anything. Your knitting piece is just not that fragile. So once it's fully saturated and we've wrung out as much of the water as you can comfortably get out, now you are just going to be laying it down into the shape that you want it to be when it is dried all the way. You can use blocking pins. For this particular project, I don't think that this needs pins. Pins are going to allow you to create something that's a very accurate size, so you could get a tape measure out and measure it and keep it the same width all the way across. For this particular scarf, I don't think that that's necessary. You just want to make it lay nice and flat and even. And the surface that I am using to lay my scarf out on, these are called blocking mats, and they're just a foam mat. I like this style because they clip together, and so you can make a long narrow one to do a scarf like this, or you can make a big rectangle to block a sweater, and they store easily and lay. You can tuck them on a shelf or in a cabinet or something when you're not using them. Now for something like a scarf with blocking, it's not going to hurt it at all if you actually double it up on top of itself if you don't have enough space to lay out an entire 6-foot scarf like this one is. It's kind of a 5.5 or 6-foot scarf. And doubling it up on top of each other actually makes you be able to tell that you've got it the same width all the way through as well. So you haven't pulled some bits a little bit wider and some bits a little bit narrower. And that is truly all there is to blocking. Get it wet, wring out as much of the water as you can, and lay it flat. You do want to let this piece dry completely. Wool can be a little bit tricky because it will feel dry when there actually is still quite a bit of water left. So it may take 2 or 3 days to dry all the way complete before you're ready to wear it. But blocking is going to make everything lay a little bit nicer. And I do always recommend that you complete your blocking before you weave the ends in. Just because blocking does make this stretch and change shape a little bit, it's better to weave your ends in after that shape change has happened rather than before, so that those ends don't pop out after you've done the hard work of weaving them in. So that is how you block your piece. The very final step in any knitting project is going to be to weave in the ends that are left when you've completed the knitting and the blocking. I did want to show you kind of the difference when you've blocked. I think the cable section shows it really well. I do always recommend blocking pieces. It's just going to make everything lay nice and flat and look a little bit neater and tidier. And I do think because the fabric itself changes and can stretch and grow with blocking, I would always recommend weaving the ends in after you have completed blocking and your piece is totally dry. That way you're not going to be weaving ends in that then later get pulled out of the fabric as it's blocked. So the only two tools that you need for this is a tapestry needle. That is a needle with an eye big enough to easily thread yarn through. The yarn ends can get a little bit frayed with the blocking, so trimming those off so that they're a little bit easier to get through is something that's fine to do if you feel like you need to. You do always want, I always say a 6-inch end. A little bit longer is fine. I would not go shorter than that. It doesn't mean you're going to weave in that entire 6 inches of string. It just means that you're probably only going to weave in 2 or 3 of it, but if you cut it only 2 or 3 inches long, it's a pain in the behind to weave that 2 or 3 inch section in. So 6 inches is just going to make it a little bit easier to do. And then there's not an exact science to weaving in ends. You generally are going to want to go close to an edge, and to me I try to follow what the fabric looks like. So with garter stitch, which is what's on the edge for your piece here, you've got these ridges right along the edge, and so I am going to choose to go under one of the little strings of the ridges each time. So I kind of go from the bottom to the top, and I'm going to go an inch or so along this line underneath. And again, not an exact science, however you want to go through your fabric is fine, and you're just going to pull that through. And then I always make sure that I pull the fabric so that that end is not going to be puckering up the fabric as you go. And then I'm always going to tell you to go back about halfway. So if you came 1.5 inches one way, you're going to go back about half of that distance. Do make sure that your yarn came out right here. If you put your needle in that exact same hole, you are going to be unweaving in the end, and you're going to be pulling your yarn out. So do make sure you don't go in the exact same spot you came out again. But again, not an exact science, just get it under a few strings and pull that all the way in. I don't think that you should take your tail all the way to the very edge, because then you have that itty bitty tail that sticks out right across the edge of your fabric. Once you've woven it in that much, you are going to take your yarn snips that are provided in your Learn to Knit kit, if you got one of the kits from us. and you are going to cut your yarn flush against the fabric. And that is all there is to weaving in the ends. On every project you'll have two ends, where you started and where you finished, and on projects that use more than one ball of yarn, you may have more than two ends. You'll have two ends for each ball or each color section that you're doing. You are going to weave all of them in the exact same way.